The whip cracked across sun-baked flesh, and the crowd roared its approval like wolves scenting blood. In the dusty plaza of Las Cruces, New Mexico Territory, under the merciless August sun of 1875, 40-some settlers had gathered for what they called justice, but looked more like a lynching. $25 for the savage, the auctioneer shouted, his voice cutting through the jeers. Come now, folks, he's strong as an ox, even if he is a murdering Apache. The chained man stood silent on the wooden platform, blood trickling from fresh welts across his back. His dark eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains, as if his spirit had already fled to some sacred place beyond the reach of chains and hatred. Children threw stones, women spat, men fingered their gun handles, eager for the killing to begin. "Kill him now!" someone shouted. "Why waste money on rope?" That's when the scarred woman stepped forward. She moved through the hostile crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, her burned face catching the harsh light. Her dress spoke of money, real money, but her expression held something the crowd hadn't expected. "Stop!" Her voice cut through the mob's fury like a cavalry saber. "I'll buy him. Name your price." The plaza fell dead silent. In the distance, dust clouds rose from 3 different directions. The woman's name was Sarah McKenna, and 3 years ago she'd lost everything that mattered. It happened on a night when the moon hid its face behind storm clouds, as if God himself couldn't bear to watch. Apache raiders struck the McKenna ranch like lightning, sudden, devastating, final. Sarah had awakened to the smell of smoke and the sound of her children screaming. Mary, 8 years old, with pigtails the color of wheat. Thomas, 6, who collected smooth river stones and built elaborate castles in the dirt. By morning, both lay still as winter ponds, their small bodies broken by tomahawks, their blood soaked into the earth they'd played on. Sarah's husband, Robert, had died trying to shield them, 3 bullets in his chest. Sarah herself bore the scars from that night. Half her face melted by flames when she'd tried to pull her children from the burning house. The Apache had left her alive, perhaps thinking death would be merciful compared to what she'd endure. They were wrong about the mercy, but they were also wrong about something else. Now, in the present moment of the town square, Captain William Morrison stepped forward, his blue uniform crisp despite the heat. He was a man who'd grown fat on frontier corruption, stealing supplies meant for Apache reservations and selling them to settlers at triple the price. "Mrs. McKenna," Morrison said, his voice carrying the false concern of a snake oil salesman, "surely you're not serious. This savage murdered your family." Sarah's scarred fingers never trembled as she counted out gold coins. $50. She said simply. "Cash." The auctioneer, a nervous man named Hutchins, looked between the crowd and the money. Legal was legal, even when it made no sense. "Sold," he squeaked. Joseph, that's what the army had called him, though his Apache name was Soaring Eagle, felt the shackles transferred from the auction post to Sarah's wagon. His dark eyes met hers for the first time, searching for the hatred he expected to find. Instead, he saw something that confused him, pain that matched his own. The wagon ride to Sarah's ranch passed mostly in silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the distant cry of hawks. Joseph sat chained in the wagon bed, studying the woman who'd bought his life. Her ranch spread across a valley like a small kingdom. Thousands of acres of grassland, hundreds of cattle, buildings that spoke of prosperity built on blood and sweat. "Why?" Joseph finally asked, the word coming out in a mixture of English and Apache. Sarah's hands tightened on the reins. "Because," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "your children They called for you at the end." The words hit Joseph like a physical blow. This woman knew something about that terrible night, something that changed everything. Dawn came early to the McKenna ranch, painting the mountains purple and gold. But there was no beauty in the gathering of ranch hands outside the bunkhouse. Jake Morrison, no relation to the captain, despite the shared name, had worked for the McKenna family for 15 years. He was a good man, mostly, but fear made even good men do ugly things. "I'm telling you straight, Mrs. McKenna," Jake said, his hat in his hands but his jaw set firm. "The boys won't work alongside no Apache. Not after what they'd done to your family." Sarah stood on her porch, still wearing the same dress from the auction, dust and dried sweat marking the fabric. Behind her, through the window, the chained Apache man sat in her kitchen, untouched food on a plate before him. "Then they can collect their pay and ride out," Sarah said. "Any man who won't follow my orders has no place on my ranch." Jake's face reddened. "Sarah, Mrs. McKenna, you're asking us to bunk down with the man who killed little Mary and Thomas. It ain't Christian. It ain't human." "Neither is treating a man like livestock," Sarah replied. "That's my final word." 7 of her 12 hands rode out that morning, leaving only the most loyal or the most desperate. Sarah watched them go without expression, but inside she felt the cold touch of isolation settling around her like morning fog. In the barn, she found Joseph examining his chains with the practiced eye of someone who'd worn them before. She brought water and clean cloth, along with a small bottle of whiskey for the wounds. "I don't need white woman's medicine," Joseph said, his English clearer now, touched with the slight accent of someone who'd learned it as a second language. "Maybe not," Sarah said, setting the supplies down anyway. "But I need to give it." She began cleaning the whip marks across his back, her touch gentle despite the trembling in her hands. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. That's when Joseph began to hum. It was a simple melody, rising and falling like wind through prairie grass. Sarah's hands stilled, her breath caught. The cloth dropped from nerveless fingers. "Where?" she whispered. "Where did you learn that song?" Joseph's humming stopped. He turned to look at her, seeing the tears she was trying so hard not to shed. "Small girl," he said carefully, "yellow hair like wheat." She sang to the stones by the river. The world tilted around Sarah. Mary had sung that song every day, had learned it from some traveling Mexican traders. She'd hummed it while braiding her doll's hair, while feeding the chickens, while— "No," Sarah breathed. "No, that's not— You couldn't." Joseph reached slowly into his shirt and withdrew a small leather pouch. His movements were careful, respectful, like a man handling something sacred. From the pouch, he pulled a blue hair ribbon, faded now, but unmistakably Mary's favorite, and a small wooden horse that Thomas had carved with his father's help. "I carry their spirits safely," Joseph said, his voice thick with a grief that matched her own. "I tried to save them. The bullets, they were meant for me." Sarah McKenna, who hadn't cried since the day she buried her children, finally wept. The truth unraveled slowly, like a rope fraying under too much weight. Joseph's English, mixed with hand signs and Apache words, painted a picture that turned Sarah's world inside out. The raid hadn't been random Apache violence. It had been Morrison's men, soldiers painted and dressed like Indians, stealing cattle and gold while making it look like tribal warfare. Joseph, scouting alone in the area, had seen the fake raiders and tried to intervene. "I called out to your husband in English," Joseph explained, his hands moving in graceful gestures as he spoke. Told him soldiers come dressed as Apache. He began to understand, but then, gunshots. Many gunshots. They sat in the meadow where Mary and Thomas used to play, where wildflowers grew in patches like scattered coins. Joseph had created a small memorial using Apache traditions, sticks arranged in a specific pattern, stones placed with careful meaning, sweet grass burning in a shallow bowl. In my people's way, Joseph said, we honor the dead with memory and story. Your children, they were brave. The little boy tried to protect his sister. The girl, she asked me to take their treasures to their mother. Sarah participated in the ceremony, her scarred hands clumsy but willing as Joseph taught her the proper gestures. For the first time since that terrible night, she felt something other than rage and emptiness. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of peace, like the first green shoots after a devastating fire. Over the following days, they developed their own language of understanding. Joseph taught her hand signs for basic concepts: peace, family, sorrow, hope. Sarah shared stories about her children, how Mary loved to braid anything she could get her hands on, how Thomas believed he could build a bridge to the moon with enough stones. In Apache, Joseph said, we call children heart walkers because they carry our hearts with them wherever they go. Heart walkers, Sarah repeated, the word feeling sacred in her mouth. But the outside world wouldn't let them grieve in peace. Pablo Martinez, the old Mexican trader who'd known Sarah since she was a bride, brought supplies and warnings in equal measure. Señora, Pablo said, his weathered face grave with concern, there are men asking questions in town, bounty hunters from 3 territories, and Captain Morrison, he is not pleased with your cheddar purchase. Let them come, Sarah said, but her voice betrayed her fear. Morrison has federal bounty hunters coming from 3 territories, Pablo warned. And something else, Señora. The Apache, they are talking. War drums in the mountains. They think their people are being sold like horses. That night, as storm clouds gathered overhead, Sarah and Joseph kept watch at the kitchen window. The coffee between them had grown cold hours ago, but neither moved to refresh it. In the distance, lightning flickered like signal fires. I should go, Joseph said quietly. My presence brings danger to you. Running won't solve anything, Sarah replied. Besides, where would you go? Morrison's made sure you're hunted in every territory. Joseph touched the pouch containing her children's belongings. I made a promise to their spirits, to keep their treasures safe and return them to their mother. That promise is fulfilled. Maybe, Sarah said, but I made a promise too, to see justice done, and that promise isn't fulfilled yet. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and through the sound, they heard something that made Sarah's blood run cold, the measured approach of many horses, moving with military precision. Dawn was still hours away, but Captain Morrison had come calling. The hoofbeats came with the false dawn, measured and threatening like a funeral drum. Sarah watched through her window as a full military patrol rode into her yard, dust swirling around the horses like smoke from a battlefield. Captain Morrison sat his horse like a man born to command, his uniform pressed despite the early hour, his brass buttons catching the first pale light of morning. Behind him rode 20 soldiers, their rifles ready, their faces set with the kind of determination that brooked no argument. Mrs. McKenna, Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of the federal government. By order of the Territorial Command, you will surrender the prisoner known as Joseph to military custody immediately. Sarah stepped onto her porch, her spine straight, despite the fear crawling up her throat. "What charges?" "Desertion from the U.S. Army," Morrison announced, unrolling an official document. "Murder of federal personnel, theft of military property, high enough crimes to see him hanged 3 times over." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Desertion. Military property? Joseph had been a soldier. Joseph emerged from the house, his chains clanking softly. But instead of the defiance Sarah expected, she saw something else in his face. Resignation, mixed with a deep, old pain. "Ah, our decorated Army Scout returns," Morrison said, his smile sharp as a skinning knife. "Sergeant Joseph Running Bear, formerly of the 7th Cavalry. Or should I say, former sergeant. Desertion has a way of stripping a man of his rank." Sarah's world tilted again. "Army Scout?" "Oh, yes," Morrison continued, clearly enjoying the revelation. "One of our finest trackers. Saved countless lives, prevented dozens of raids. Until he decided to turn on his own kind, that is, until he started selling information to the Apache, helping them plan their attacks." "That's a lie," Joseph said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. Morrison's laugh was like breaking glass. "Is it? Then explain why you were found at the scene of the McKenna massacre. Explain why you had the children's belongings. Explain why you disappeared for 3 years before we finally tracked you down." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Joseph had been the perfect scapegoat, a half-breed caught between 2 worlds, trusted by neither, easy to blame when Morrison needed a cover story for his own crimes. "You want to know the truth, Mrs. McKenna?" Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. "Your scout here was feeding information to Apache war parties. Every raid, every attack, every dead settler family. He helped plan them all, including yours." "No," Sarah breathed, but doubt crept into her voice like poison. Joseph met her eyes steadily. "I was tracking the real raiders," he said. "Morrison's men, dressed as Apache. I found your ranch too late to save your family, but not too late to see who really killed them." Morrison's face went pale, then flushed red with rage. "Enough, Mrs. McKenna, you will surrender this man now or face federal charges for harboring a fugitive." Sarah looked between the captain and the Apache man she'd begun to trust. One of them was lying. One of them was telling the truth. And her choice would determine not just Joseph's fate, but the fate of justice itself. "I want to see the evidence," she said finally. "Evidence?" Morrison sputtered. "My word as an officer isn't enough?" "In territorial court," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "with proper legal representation. If he's guilty, he'll hang, but he deserves a fair trial." Morrison's smile turned predatory. "Very well, but Mrs. McKenna, when the truth comes out, and it will, remember that you chose to stand with a murderer against the United States Army." As the patrol wheeled and rode away, Sarah found Morrison's military medal among Joseph's few possessions, a medal that shouldn't have been there, a medal that told a story Morrison didn't want told. But in the distance, war drums had begun to beat, echoing across the valley like the heartbeat of an angry god. 200 Apache warriors were gathering on the mesa, and they were coming for their son. The Apache drums beat through the night like thunder that wouldn't end, and by morning, Las Cruces looked like a town preparing for war or exodus, and most folks couldn't decide which. Wagons rolled east loaded with families and their most precious belongings. Businesses shuttered their windows and doors. The few who remained moved in nervous clusters, jumping at shadows and checking their weapons with the obsessive care of men who expected to die. Sarah stood in her empty barn, listening to the sound of her world crumbling. 7 more hands had ridden out during the night, leaving only Jake and 2 others, men too poor to have anywhere else to go, or too loyal to abandon her completely. "Mrs. McKenna," Jake said, his hat in his hands, "I ain't gonna lie to you. The boys are scared. Half the territory's running, and here we are sitting in the middle of what's gonna be a war zone." Through the barn door, they could see the Apache positions on the distant mesa, tiny figures that somehow conveyed immense threat, like storm clouds on the horizon. Military estimates put their numbers at over 200 warriors, the largest gathering in territorial history. "They ain't here for war," Joseph said quietly from his position by the water trough, his chains allowing him just enough movement to tend the horses. "They come for me." "You?" Jake's voice cracked like a teenager's. "What makes you so special?" Joseph's answer came in a mixture of English and Apache, translated haltingly. Was the lost son of Chief Standing Bear, taken as a child, raised by soldiers. They thought me dead 20 years. The silence that followed was profound as Sunday prayer. Sarah felt the weight of revelation settling on her like dust after a landslide. Not just an army scout, not just a half-breed caught between worlds, a chief's son, stolen from his people, raised by the very army that fought his tribe. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Jake whispered. "No wonder they're gathering. They've come to take back their prince." Federal reinforcements arrived that afternoon, 3 companies of cavalry, their blue uniforms dark with sweat and dust. They set up camp on the opposite side of town from the Apache positions, creating a deadly triangle with Sarah's ranch at the center. Captain Morrison strutted through the military camp like a rooster in a henhouse, pointing at maps and issuing orders with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. But Sarah noticed something in his movements, a nervous energy, a quickness to anger when questioned. A young Apache brave slipped through both army lines that evening, moving like smoke across the landscape. He brought with him a traditional war arrow, not painted for killing, but carved with specific symbols that Joseph read with growing amazement. "They don't come for war," Joseph translated, his voice thick with emotion he rarely showed. "They come for judgment. Apache law says blood must answer for blood, but they also say truth must be heard before justice is done." The message was clear. Sarah had until the new moon to surrender Joseph, or 200 Apache warriors would take him by force. The territorial government would respond with overwhelming violence. The bloodbath would make the recent Indian wars look like children's games. That night, as Sarah sat vigil in her kitchen, Joseph made an offer that broke her heart. "I will go to them," he said simply. "Tonight. Slip away. You have done enough." "Like hell you will," Sarah replied, her voice sharp as a slap. "You don't understand," Joseph continued. "Apache justice is different from white law. If I surrender willingly, speak truth before the council, perhaps both our peoples avoid war. And if you're lying about Morrison, if you really did help plan the raid on my family?" Joseph met her eyes steadily. "Then I die with honor, and you live with clear conscience." Sarah stared at this man who was willing to sacrifice himself, possibly unjustly, to save her from the consequences of her own compassion. Outside, coyotes howled across the desert, their voices echoing the loneliness that had defined her life since losing her family. "No," she said finally. "We see this through together, both of us, or neither." Joseph nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a bridge finally completed. But neither of them saw the figure watching from the shadows. a young Apache boy who'd been sent to observe, who now raced back to the mesa with news that would change everything. The white woman with the scarred face had chosen to stand with Chief Standing Bear's son, in Apache tradition that made her family, and family was worth fighting for. The Apache messenger returned at dawn, but this time he didn't slip through the shadows like smoke. He rode boldly up to Sarah's porch, dismounted, and approached Joseph with a reverence that made Jake cross himself and mutter prayers in Spanish. The boy spoke rapidly in Apache, his words tumbling over each other like stones down a mountain. Joseph's face transformed as he listened, surprise, then wonder, then something approaching awe. "What's he saying?" Sarah demanded. Joseph's voice was barely a whisper. He says, my father lives, Chief Standing Bear. He says I am not just any warrior returning home. I am the son he mourned as dead for 20 years. The words hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and impossible to grasp. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her again. Not just a scout, not just a warrior, a chief's son, heir to leadership of one of the most powerful Apache bands in the territory. A man whose capture and potential execution could start a war that would consume everything from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. "Sweet Jesus," Jake breathed. "No wonder Morrison wants him dead so bad." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't just framed Joseph for the raid, he deliberately targeted the son of a prominent chief, knowing that Joseph's execution would provoke massive Apache retaliation. Retaliation that would justify increased military presence, more federal money, more opportunities for corruption. It was a plan of breathtaking cynicism, and it was working perfectly. That afternoon, Morrison arrived with a federal judge in tow, a thin, nervous man named Hawthorne who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the territory. The kangaroo court convened in the town square with Morrison as prosecutor, Hawthorne as judge, and no defense attorney in sight. "Mrs. McKenna," Judge Hawthorne said, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the shade, "you're not a lawyer. You can't represent this man in federal court." "Then I'll speak as a witness," Sarah replied, standing straighter than she had since her children died. "I have evidence that Captain Morrison's testimony is false." Morrison's face flushed red. "Evidence? What evidence could you possibly—" "This." Sarah held up the military medal she'd found among Joseph's possessions. "Your medal, Captain. The one awarded for bravery during the Apache campaigns. The one you reported stolen 3 years ago. The one you claimed was taken during the raid on my ranch." The crowd murmured, sensing blood in the water. "How?" Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the square like a church bell. "Did your medal end up in the possession of the man you claim led the raid? Unless he took it from your men when he tried to stop them." Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "That proves nothing. He could have—" "Pablo Martinez has more evidence," Sarah announced. The old Mexican trader stepped forward, his weathered hands holding a bundle of papers. "Señores, I keep records of all trade. 3 years ago, the night of the McKenna raid, I sold supplies to men in blue uniforms, men who painted their faces like Apache, who spoke English, who paid in gold coins marked with U.S. Army stamps." Judge Hawthorne examined the papers with growing unease. "Captain Morrison, do you have an explanation for—" "Forgeries!" Morrison snapped. "Mexican lies bought with Apache gold." But the crowd was beginning to turn. Doubt spread through the gathering like wildfire, fed by years of suspicion about Morrison's sudden wealth, his expensive habits, his reluctance to engage Apache war parties in direct combat. Chief Standing Bear himself arrived as the sun reached its zenith, riding into town with a dignity that made the assembled soldiers straighten unconsciously. He was an old man, his hair silver as moonlight, but his presence filled the square like the shadow of a thundercloud. He spoke in Apache, his words formal and ceremonial. Joseph translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says he has come to reclaim his son, stolen as a child during a cavalry raid 20 years ago. He says the white woman who stands with his son has shown honor, and Apache law protects those who show honor. The chief continued, and Joseph's translation grew more urgent. He says if his son is executed without proof of guilt, 200 warriors will consider it an act of war. But if the truth is spoken, if justice is done, Apache and white law can both be satisfied. Judge Hawthorne looked between Morrison and the chief, clearly calculating political consequences. Captain, in light of these irregularities, perhaps we should postpone. No! Morrison's control finally snapped. This savage dies today, by federal law, by military justice. I won't have my authority questioned by Mexican traders and Apache chiefs. The chief spoke again, and this time his words carried the weight of absolute finality. Joseph translated with growing amazement. He says, he invokes the old law, trial by combat, single fight between champions, with truth proven by victory. He offers this to prevent war between our peoples. Sarah stepped forward before she fully realized what she was doing. I'll be his champion. The square erupted in shouting, but Chief Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. When he spoke again, even the children stopped their playing to listen. He says, Joseph whispered, that a woman who would fight for justice when her own people turn against her is a woman worthy of Apache respect. He accepts your offer. Morrison drew himself up to his full height. Fine. If these savages want their trial by combat, they'll have it. Dawn tomorrow. I'll fight her myself. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah realized what she'd committed herself to. Trial by combat with a trained soldier, a man who'd killed Apaches in hand-to-hand fighting, a man who had nothing left to lose. But as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of blood, she also realized something else. Tomorrow would determine not just Joseph's fate, but the future of peace between two peoples who'd been enemies for too long. She had until dawn to prepare for the fight of her life, literally. The night before trial by combat, 3 armies settled into their positions like pieces on a chessboard. Apache warriors lined the mesa like stone sentinels. Federal cavalry surrounded the town in defensive squares. And Sarah's ranch sat in the middle of it all, like the eye of a hurricane. Sarah had never felt so alone, yet paradoxically, she'd never felt less alone. Chief Standing Bear had sent his finest weapons master to train her, an old warrior named Gray Wolf, who spoke no English but communicated volumes through demonstration and gesture. Apache combat different from white fighting, Joseph translated, as Gray Wolf showed Sarah the proper grip for the war club that would be her primary weapon. Not about strength, about balance, about reading your enemy, about using their force against them. The weapons were traditional: war clubs, knives, no firearms allowed. Combat would continue until one fighter yielded or died. There would be no mercy, no second chances, no appeals to higher authority. Morrison had spent the evening drinking and boasting in the town saloon, his voice carrying across the night air as he regaled listeners with tales of his combat prowess. But Sarah noticed something in his bravado, an edge of desperation, a need to convince himself as much as others. He's scared, she realized aloud. Good, said Grey Wolf through Joseph's translation. Scared man makes mistakes. Angry man makes bigger mistakes. You make him both. As midnight approached, Chief Standing Bear himself came to speak with Sarah. His words, filtered through Joseph's careful translation, carried the weight of prophecy. He says you fight not just for one man's life, but for the possibility that two peoples can live without endless war. He says the spirits of your children watch, and they are proud of the woman their mother has become. The words hit Sarah harder than any physical blow. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of survivor's guilt, wondering if she'd failed Mary and Thomas by living when they had died. Now, for the first time, she could imagine them approving of her choices. Tell him, Sarah said quietly, that I'm honored by his words. And tell him that if I die tomorrow, Joseph has my blessing to return to his people. The chief's response came with a slight smile. He says you will not die. He says women who fight for justice when justice seems impossible are protected by powers greater than any man's strength. But as the night deepened, Morrison made one final play. He arrived at Sarah's porch just before dawn, no longer the confident officer, but a desperate man facing the collapse of everything he'd built through corruption and violence. Mrs. McKenna, he said, his voice hoarse from drinking and shouting, I'm prepared to offer you one last chance. Call off this combat. Take your Apache pet and leave the territory. I'll provide safe passage, money, a new start somewhere else. Why? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about what motivated this man. Morrison's facade cracked, revealing the frightened creature underneath. Because some things are bigger than one woman's need for revenge. Because there are interests at stake here that you couldn't possibly understand. Whose interests, Captain? Yours. Or the men who've been buying stolen Apache goods through your supply network? Morrison's face went white. You don't know what you're talking about. I think I do. I think you've been stealing from Apache reservations, selling the supplies to settlers, and using Joseph as a scapegoat to cover your tracks. I think the raid on my ranch was meant to kill him before he could expose your operation. The accuracy of her guess was written across Morrison's face in stark terror. You have no idea how far this goes, he whispered. How many important men are involved, how much money is at stake. If you pursue this, you'll make enemies that will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Maybe, Sarah replied, but I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. Can you say the same? Morrison straightened, his mask sliding back into place. Dawn, then, and Mrs. McKenna. I've killed 12 men in personal combat, Apache, Mexican, white. I won't show you mercy because you're a woman. I wouldn't want you to, Sarah said. As Morrison walked away, Chief Standing Bear emerged from the shadows where he'd been listening. His words needed no translation. He fears you more than you fear him. That fear will be his defeat. The first pale light of dawn was touching the eastern mountains, and with it came the moment that would determine the fate of everyone Sarah had come to care about. She was as ready as she'd ever be. Dawn broke like a promise over the high desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red, while 3 armies watched 2 people prepare to decide the fate of peace or war. The combat circle had been marked according to Apache tradition, 30 feet across, blessed with sacred sage, witnessed by representatives of both peoples. Chief Standing Bear sat on one side, Judge Hawthorne on the other, their presence lending official weight to what might otherwise have been mere blood sport. Sarah entered the circle carrying the war club Grey Wolf had chosen for her, ironwood carved with symbols she didn't understand, but somehow trusted. Her dress was simple calico, practical for movement, with her hair braided back Apache style to keep it from her eyes. Morrison entered from the opposite side, armed with a cavalry saber and a confidence born of 12 previous victories. He'd sobered up during the night, and now moved with the deadly grace of a professional killer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Hawthorne called out, his voice carrying across the valley. "This combat is sanctioned by both territorial law and Apache custom. Fight continues until one participant yields or dies. May God have mercy on both their souls." Morrison attacked immediately, his saber whistling through the morning air with lethal precision. Sarah barely got her club up in time to deflect the blow, the impact sending shock waves up her arms. "You should have taken my offer," Morrison grunted, pressing his attack with brutal efficiency. "Should have run when you had the chance." Sarah gave ground steadily, using Grey Wolf's lessons to stay alive, while Morrison's superior strength and experience told. The crowd watched in tense silence, broken only by the ring of steel on wood and the harsh breathing of two people fighting for their lives. "You know what's funny?" Morrison said conversationally as he drove Sarah back toward the circle's edge. "Your precious Apache didn't even try to save your children. He just watched them die." The words were meant to break her concentration, but they had the opposite effect. Sarah's grief transformed into pure, focused rage. She stopped retreating and began to counterattack, her war club whistling through the air with surprising speed and accuracy. Morrison's confidence began to crack as Sarah's desperation made her unpredictable. Grey Wolf had been right. Scared men make mistakes, and Morrison was beginning to realize he might lose. "You want to know the truth?" he snarled, his saber work becoming wilder, more desperate. "You really want to know what happened that night?" "I know what happened," Sarah replied, her club smashing into his sword guard. "You led the raid yourself." "More than that." Morrison's control finally shattered completely. "I killed them myself. Your husband, your children, I put bullets in them personally." The admission rang across the combat circle like a church bell, heard by hundreds of witnesses from both peoples. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, his face pale with shock. "They saw me loading the stolen gold," Morrison continued, beyond caring now about consequences. "Your husband recognized my voice when I gave orders. They all had to die, don't you see? It was business, nothing personal." Sarah's war club caught him across the ribs with a sound like breaking branches. Morrison staggered, blood flowing from his mouth, but kept fighting with the fury of the damned. "I needed the money," he screamed. "Do you have any idea what a captain's pay is? What it costs to live like a gentleman? The Apache gold, the supply contracts, the cattle rustling. It was all business." Another blow from Sarah's club, this one to his sword arm. The saber flew from nerveless fingers, leaving Morrison defenseless. "Your children died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time," Morrison gasped, falling to his knees. "Just like you'll die because you couldn't leave well enough alone." He pulled a hidden knife from his boot, a violation of combat rules, but the act of a desperate man. Sarah saw it coming and brought her war club down with all her remaining strength. Morrison crumpled to the dirt, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes already glazing with approaching death. But with his last breath, he spoke one final truth. "The network goes all the way to Washington. Senators, generals, territorial governors. You've won this battle, but you'll never win the war." Silence settled over the combat circle like dust after an explosion. Morrison was dead, his confession heard by hundreds of witnesses, the truth finally exposed for all to see. Judge Hawthorne stood slowly, his face grave with the weight of what he'd witnessed. In the matter of the territory versus Joseph Running Bear, all charges are dismissed. The real perpetrator has confessed and paid the ultimate price for his crimes. Chief Standing Bear rose and walked to the center of the circle, his weathered hands gentle as he helped Sarah to her feet. When he spoke, his words carried the formality of ancient law and the warmth of genuine respect. Joseph translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says the white woman with the scarred face has shown courage that would honor any Apache warrior. He says she has proven that justice lives in the heart, not in the color of skin. The old chief continued, and Joseph's translation grew more wondering. He says, he offers you adoption into our tribe. You would be his daughter, with all rights and protections that brings. You would be family. Sarah looked around the circle, at the Apache warriors who had ridden here prepared for war, at the federal soldiers who had come expecting a massacre, at the townspeople who had watched her risk everything for truth. Tell him, she said quietly, that I'm honored beyond words. But I have a different answer. Chief Standing Bear waited, his dark eyes patient as stone. Tell him I choose to stay on my ranch, but I want Joseph to stay with me, if he's willing. Not as prisoner, not as employee, but as partner. Equal partner in everything I own. The translation brought a rare smile to the old chief's face. He spoke again, and Joseph's voice cracked as he rendered the words. He says, love that chooses to bridge two worlds instead of joining one is the strongest love of all. He gives his blessing to our partnership and declares the McKenna Ranch neutral ground where Apache, Mexican, and white can trade in peace. Judge Hawthorne stepped forward, still shaken by Morrison's confession, but aware of his official duties. Mrs. McKenna, this court officially recognizes Mr. Joseph Running Bear as a free man, cleared of all charges. And, given the captain's confession about the corruption network, I'll be recommending a full federal investigation. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed in the valley. The Apache warriors weren't riding away in anger. They were setting up camps, preparing for peaceful trade. Mexican families who had fled were already returning with their wagons. Even some of the townspeople looked ready to accept this new reality. But the victory had come at a cost. Sarah swayed on her feet, adrenaline finally fading, the full impact of her wounds and exhaustion hitting her all at once. Joseph caught her before she could fall, his strong arms surprisingly gentle as he supported her weight. "Easy," he murmured. "You've done enough heroics for one day." "Have I?" Sarah asked, leaning against him and feeling for the first time in 3 years like she might actually have a future worth living. "More than enough," Joseph replied. "Now let someone else take care of you for a change." As they walked toward her ranch house, their ranch house now, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart swell with unexpected hope. Children were playing at the edge of the crowd, Apache and Mexican and white children, sharing toys and games as if the hatred between their peoples had never existed. Maybe Morrison had been right about one thing. The corruption network would continue, reaching into the highest levels of government. But he'd been wrong about something more important. Love was stronger than business. Truth was stronger than lies. And sometimes, when you fought hard enough for justice, you could change the world, even if only a small piece of it. The war between the peoples wasn't over. But here in this valley, it had just taken a very different turn. 6 months later, the McKenna Ranch looked like something out of a dream, or perhaps like what the American frontier might have been if fear hadn't poisoned the well of possibility. Apache families had built traditional wickiups alongside the original ranch buildings. Mexican traders had established a permanent market where three cultures exchanged goods, stories, and friendship. Even a few white families had returned, drawn by the promise of prosperity and peace. Sarah stood on her porch, their porch, watching Joseph work with a mixed crew of Apache, Mexican, and white cowboys to round up cattle for the spring drive. The sight never failed to amaze her. Men who had been taught to hate each other working side by side, sharing techniques and jokes in three different languages. The federal investigation had indeed uncovered Morrison's corruption network, reaching all the way to territorial governors and congressional appropriations committees. 12 men had been indicted, and the stolen Apache supplies were being returned with interest. It wasn't perfect justice. It never was, but it was a start. Chief Standing Bear visited monthly, officially to check on trade agreements, but really to spend time with the son he'd thought lost forever. The old chief had aged visibly since Joseph's return, but aged peacefully, like a man whose deepest wound had finally been healed. "Señora Sara," Pablo Martinez called out from the trading post. "The new teacher has arrived from Santa Fe." The school had been Joseph's idea, a place where children of all three cultures could learn together, where Apache oral traditions could be preserved alongside Mexican history and American literature. Finding a teacher willing to work in such an unusual situation had taken months, but they'd finally succeeded. Sarah walked to where the teacher's wagon had stopped, curious to meet the woman brave enough to take on such an ambitious project. She was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 25, with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd faced challenges before. "Miss Rodriguez?" Sarah extended her hand. "I'm Sarah McKenna." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. McKenna. I've heard remarkable things about what you've built here." The teacher's grip was firm, her eyes taking in the mixed community with obvious approval. "I must admit, when I was offered this position, I wasn't sure what to expect." "And now?" Miss Rodriguez smiled, watching Apache children play with Mexican and white youngsters in the yard of the half-built schoolhouse. "Now I think I'm exactly where God intended me to be." That evening, Sarah and Joseph sat on their porch as they did most nights, watching the sun set over the valley while the sounds of three communities settling into sleep drifted on the desert air. Apache mothers sang lullabies, Mexican fathers told stories, white families said their prayers, different words, different customs, but the same love underneath it all. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked quietly. "The warrior life, the simple certainty of knowing who your enemies were?" Joseph considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember that the greatest warriors are the ones who turn enemies into family." A small sound made them both look up. A young Apache girl, maybe 8 years old, the same age Mary had been, approached the porch shyly, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. She spoke in Apache, and Joseph translated. "She says her grandmother made this for you. She says you are the brave woman who chose love over hate, and she wants you to have something beautiful." Sarah unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside was a mirror, not glass, but polished silver, surrounded by intricate beadwork that caught the last light of sunset. Around the edge, someone had sewn tiny symbols in different colors. Apache spirals for the journey of life, Mexican crosses for faith, and American stars for hope. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, seeing her scarred face reflected back, surrounded by symbols of three cultures learning to live as one. The little girl spoke again, and Joseph's translation came with a smile. "She says her grandmother wants you to remember that scars tell stories of battles survived, not battles lost. As the child scampered back to her family, Sarah held the mirror up to catch the last rays of sunlight. Her reflection looked different somehow, not unscarred, but not defined by the scars either. For the first time since that terrible night 3 years ago, she looked like a woman who belonged in the world of the living. "The children are the real victory," Joseph said softly, watching the youngsters disappear into their various homes. Apache children learning English, white children learning Apache hand signs, Mexican children teaching everyone to dance. They'll grow up thinking this is normal. "Maybe it is normal," Sarah replied. "Maybe we just forgot for a while." That night, as they prepared for bed in the house they now shared as partners in every sense of the word, Sarah placed the gifted mirror on her dressing table next to the small memorial she'd made for Mary and Thomas. The juxtaposition seemed right somehow, past grief and present hope, memory and possibility, scars and healing all existing in the same space. Joseph paused in the doorway, following her gaze. "They would be proud of you," he said simply. "Your children, proud of the bridges you've built from the ashes of your anger." "Our children now," Sarah corrected gently. "All of them, Apache, Mexican, white. They're all our children now." Outside, coyotes howled across the desert, but their voices no longer sounded lonely to Sarah's ears. They sounded like families calling to each other across the vast distances, maintaining connection despite the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The federal investigation would continue, creating powerful enemies. Weather and economics would test their fragile prosperity. Old prejudices would die hard, and new conflicts would certainly arise. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah McKenna fell asleep without nightmares, her dreams filled instead with the sound of children laughing in 3 languages and the sight of former enemies working side by side under the same endless sky. Love had indeed proven stronger than hatred, and sometimes that was victory enough. Now you might be wondering what happened to Sarah and Joseph in the years that followed. Well, I can tell you that love built on shared sorrow and mutual respect is the kind that lasts through seasons of drought and plenty alike. They never had an easy road, mind you. There were plenty of folks who never forgave Sarah for choosing an Apache man over the prejudices of her time. Federal investigators kept sniffing around, looking for evidence that the corruption network extended further than anyone wanted to admit. And old hatreds die hard. There were incidents, conflicts, moments when it seemed like the whole fragile piece might shatter like glass in a hailstorm. But Sarah McKenna had learned something in that dusty plaza where she first spoke up for justice. Sometimes the hardest choice is the only right one. She'd discovered that mercy isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing a human being can offer when the whole world is screaming for blood. And Joseph Running Bear, caught between 2 worlds for most of his life, finally found a place where being mixed blood was an advantage, not a curse. He became the bridge between peoples who had forgotten how to talk to each other, proving that honor doesn't depend on the color of your skin or the language of your prayers. You see, friends, we all have our tribes, don't we? Our own people, our own ways of seeing the world, our own comfortable prejudices that tell us who to trust and who to fear. And we all have our Captain Morrison, that voice in our heads whispering that it's safer to hate what we don't understand, easier to strike first than risk being hurt. But every now and then, if we're fortunate, we meet someone like Sarah McKenna. Someone who shows us that there's another way to live, a harder way maybe, but one that leads to something better than just surviving. Someone who proves that the worst pain in our lives can become the foundation for the greatest good we'll ever do. Those children Sarah lost didn't die in vain, if their memory taught their mother how to save a life. That Apache man didn't suffer 20 years of exile for nothing if it led him to a woman brave enough to stand against the whole world for what's right. Sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest strengths. Our most terrible losses transform into our most precious gifts. Sarah and Joseph lived long, full lives after that day of combat in the circle. They raised horses and cattle, hosted travelers from all three cultures, and watched their school become a model that other communities tried to copy. The ranch became known throughout the Southwest as a place where different peoples could come together without losing what made them unique. When they grew old together, and they did grow old together, which is its own kind of victory, folks would come from hundreds of miles away just to hear them tell the story of how love conquered hatred in a dusty New Mexico valley. They never tired of telling it, because they understood that some stories need to be told again and again, passed down from generation to generation like precious heirlooms. The mirror that Apache grandmother made for Sarah still hangs in the ranch house, they say. And if you look into it just right, when the light is soft and golden, like it gets at sunset in high desert country, you can see more than just your own reflection. You can see the faces of all the children, Apache, Mexican, and white, who grew up believing that love was stronger than fear, that justice was worth fighting for, and that families could be chosen as well as born. If this old tale has touched something in your heart, if it's reminded you that courage never goes out of style, and that mercy is always the harder but better choice, then maybe you'll share it with someone who needs that reminder. Because in this world that seems to get harder and more divided each day, we need more people like Sarah McKenna, people willing to look past scars and see the person underneath, people brave enough to choose love when hate would be so much easier. Sometimes a story about two wounded souls finding each other across an impossible divide is exactly what someone needs to hear. Sometimes it's exactly what we all need to remember, that love remembers, hope endures, and the human heart, scarred though it may be, has a remarkable capacity for healing.